President Donald Trump will visit the Federal Reserve headquarters today, this amid ongoing tensions between the administration and the central bank. Trump has been critical of Powell for not cutting rates more aggressively. Meanwhile, Trump is also considering supporting a bill to eliminate the capital gains tax on home sales. Trump has spoken favorably about the proposal on two separate occasions this month. Joining us now to discuss is Lydia Mashburn Newman, Managing Director of Monetary Economics at the American Institute for Economic Research. Good afternoon, Lydia. Thanks for joining us again. So what do you think might be motivating President Trump's recent comments and his visit to the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, so as we know, President Trump has been pretty critical of Chairman Powell, too late Powell, as he's been calling him, among other names. And most of his criticism has been geared toward Powell's monetary policy decisions. But the president is prevented from removing the chair of the Fed for anything but cause. But in recent weeks, in the last month or so, there have been calls that perhaps there is a possibility of removing him for cause for the cost overruns of this federal building project, these renovations to two areas of the Federal Reserve's real estate. And so the administration has been diving into this in detail to try to figure out if there is really a level of misconduct in the cost overruns of this project. Some other legislators have been curious if Powell may have potentially misspoke or may have even perjured himself to a certain extent by stating the costs of this building renovation. But a lot of it seems to be geared toward making an avenue for dealing with the concerns that President Trump has with the stance of interest rates. So it really actually comes down to the stance of monetary policy, Trump wanting the Fed to cut and the Fed not having cut, at least not cut this year during his presidency. And so I do think that that might be spilling over quite a bit into this conversation about cost overruns in this building project.
So on this subject, the independence of the central bank or the Federal Reserve come into question. So maybe we can talk about that. Could you explain for those that are not well versed in the subject why it is important to have independence of the Federal Reserve?
So this is a great question. What we mean by independence is actually incredibly important. A lot of people assume we say independence, meaning we want this entity to be completely outside of the scope of any elected officials. But our Constitution actually requires that the Federal Reserve be accountable to Congress because our Constitution rests our monetary authority with Congress, and they have delegated it to the Federal Reserve to behave in a way that maximizes what is in statute. They're supposed to maximize employment, and they're supposed to create long-run steady prices. And so that is what the Fed is tasked with doing by Congress. And so that is a level of independence, but also a level of accountability that Congress has over the Fed and that the Fed has to Congress. The independence that a lot of people are concerned about is whether political pressure can push on the scales of monetary policy to sort of be expedient for whoever might be in power at that time. So we're talking about sort of using monetary policy, which is the authority and power to create money, in order to juice the economy to potentially benefit those who have been elected to political office. That's the kind of independence you do want to have, because we have a ton of history that shows if a government can put pressure on your monetary authority to print money when it's expedient for them, it leads to long-term economic downturns. It can overextend the economy. It leads to the boom and bust cycle of the business cycle, and it can lead to recessions or even depressions. So it might be expedient in the front end to lower rates quite a bit, like President Trump has been asking for. But if they are lower than what the economy really needs, it actually can cause really poor incentives in the economy that can have disastrous consequences later down the road. And we saw this somewhat in the Great Depression era. We saw this also happen under Lyndon Johnson as well as President Nixon, where both of them put pressure on the Federal Reserve chairs to make monetary policy easier or looser, that is, print more money. And both of those led to the buildup that created the great both inflation and stagflation we experienced in the 1970s. So it is this, when we say independence, we're trying to prevent that kind of thing from happening. But we also want to be clear, the Fed is accountable to Congress. So for cost overruns like this building project, this is something that we would actually like to see some good sunlight to be shed on it to make sure they're acting in good faith with their efforts in this building project as well as any other operations.
So the question is, if the president says it'll be nice to have a lower interest rate, the benchmark Fed funds rate, or commenting on the benefits of cutting rates by 1% or whatever the number may be, is that undermining at all, just commenting on that, undermining monetary policy, the independence of the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, there are some arguments that the Fed delaying having cut interest rates throughout the entirety of 2025 is almost the opposite of the political pressure, meaning they are actually succumbing to political pressure that is trying to get them to reduce rates by not then reducing rates. And the thing that as economists we want to do is we want to figure out, it shouldn't be about whether one group wants rates lower or another group doesn't want them to go low yet. What we want to say is, what is the economy actually calling for? What is the level of interest rates that actually match up with the savings and investment in the economy? And the Fed should be targeted toward that type of effort as opposed to holding rates steady because they don't want to look like they are succumbing to political pressure, or reducing rates simply because of political pressure. So a lot of this has kind of gotten a little tangled. And what I like to encourage people to do is look through all the noise of the rhetoric and let's look at what the economy needs and have a substantive conversation about what should the level of interest rates actually be, given where the economy is today, both in terms of growth, inflation, and employment. And so those are the factors that really should be driving monetary policy, not one group wanting rates lower or another group wanting to protest by keeping rates steady, which one might argue is what some of what the Federal Reserve officials have been doing of late.
So how might this conflict, if you want to call it that, shape the selection process for the next Fed chair? Because I can't help wonder if we're likely to see a new chair that is more responsive to the president.
So that is the $1 million question, or maybe it's the $9 trillion question, which is the size of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, or was the height of the size of the Fed's balance sheet. It's gotten lower, but it is a big question. It does seem that in order to get the nod from President Trump, he's looking for somebody who's going to be what we call more dovish, somebody who might want lower interest rates, at least compared to current policy. And that's sort of the advertising that a person who wants to be considered needs to kind of showcase, that they may be willing or have a good reason for saying why rates should be lower. But here again, we got to go back to the economy itself. Do rates really need to be lower? There are certain metrics that say that they could stand to be a little bit lower. Maybe monetary policy is slightly tight, but there are very few indicators saying that monetary policy is inordinately tight and we should reduce by 100, 200, or even 300 basis points as President Trump has called for. That would get us down to something like a 1% interest rate, 1.5% interest rate, which are levels that we really haven't seen except during unusual circumstances like after the financial crisis, when we had a number of other issues going on. That actually wasn't an indication of a healthy economy. It was more of an indication of slow business growth. So we do want to be cautious. Like, low rates can be great and are great for those who receive them on the front end, but they can sow the seeds for poor economic investments that aren't sustainable in the long run. But I do anticipate that Trump will look for somebody who will support his view that rates should be much, much lower. But there's an important thing to remember here, not to go on too much, but this really does matter. We are starting to view the Fed as sort of a monolithic entity that the chair sets policy. But Fed interest rates are actually set by a body of the 7 board members in D.C., as well as a rotating mix of regional Fed presidents. And there used to be a time when you had different disagreements about what the level of rates would be, and the members would vote on those disagreements. But we've gotten so used to this consensus policy that now we're presuming that the single person of the Fed chair is now solely setting policy, which is not how the Federal Reserve System was designed or set up, and it does heavily reduce accountability and balance if that is the future direction the Fed continues to go in, which is the type of chair that President Trump seems to be desirous of.
Okay, changing topics, we do have another item to talk about, and that is President Trump saying that ending capital tax gains on home sales would create more incentives for home buyers to list their properties for sale. So my question to you is, what is the capital gains tax on home sales, and do you think getting rid of it would boost the housing market?
So the capital gains tax on home sales is if you have a home that is your primary home, you only have to pay a capital gain tax on the portion that's above 250,000 of an increase in value or above 500,000 in the increase in value. And I think what President Trump's trying to get at is that home prices have gone up so significantly that the potential for anyone who has been in their home for 15 or 20 years, especially maybe 30 years, that they will suffer very large capital gains tax, and therefore it's an incentive for them to stay in place and not put their homes on the market. I do think that the economics of that is such that really maybe we need to index those levels to be higher due to the 20-25% inflation we have seen just since 2020. But I'm not sure that you need to fully reduce the capital gains tax as much as the president is looking to do, or whether that will actually encourage enough people to put their homes on the market. I think the unfortunate thing is that from an optics standpoint, it really does look like it would benefit mostly wealthier Americans across the board with high incomes. And that is something that may not go over very well with the rest of Congress, and Congress would have to act to make this change. And I don't know if it's really going to encourage people to leave their homes, if that's really the reason that people are staying. People with very high value home price gains, that maybe is slightly impacting them, but it especially is impacting those with second homes. But again, is this just basically creating a boon for people who already have a large share of wealth, and will this create poor optics? I think there's a lot still to unpack here, but lower taxes in general are better. It encourages people just to make decisions based on the economics that they see, and that would be preferential in the long run. But the point of getting from here to there, we're very far from that, probably.
Okay, just one more question before we wrap up here. Do you think without this capital gains tax on home sales, could that lead to more speculative behavior or flipping in the housing market potentially?
It is possible, depending on how it's crafted. If it's a straight across the board elimination of capital gains taxes, I think there's an argument to be made, and I haven't looked directly at the data, but it does seem that it would largely benefit people who have either secondary homes or who have investment properties. And that's a discussion we should have. The lower the capital gains rate, usually the more investment activity you encourage. So that can be a boon to the overall economy. But in terms of helping your ordinary homeowner, there's already a significant deduction for your primary residence. So I'm not sure that it would actually benefit regular ordinary Americans for the most part, and it may end up mostly benefiting investors in real estate, which can have its own benefits to the economy, as I was mentioning. But I think we should be clear about what is the goal here with this change in policy.
Okay, Lydia, always great to talk to you. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me again. Always a pleasure.